Good morning. I want to offer a word of thanks to our staff for their planning and participation in today's worship service. I want to thank Irina and Hillary for their beautiful music, and I want to thank Jonathan and Catherine and Tilly for their leadership, and I especially want to thank Catherine for the newly designed worship guide that we've been using for the last 2 weeks. Most importantly, I want to thank each of you for your participation in this act of corporate worship. When we gather as the church called Sardis, we do so together as a faith community, listening for God's call in our lives, both individually and collectively. And it is good to gather in such a place with joy and celebration for a good Creator. Our lesson this morning comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 13, verses 24 through 30 and 36 through 43. This is not the easiest passage to listen to, and my goal in sharing it with you today is to try to draw out some of that goodness in the God we worship. So hear now these good words. Verse 24 begins, Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? The master answered, An enemy has done this. And the slaves said to the master, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But the master replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. We pick up in verse 36. Then Jesus left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parables of the weeds of the field. Jesus answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers. And they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. Friends, these are good words from a good God for you, a good people. Thanks be to God. Our sermon this morning is entitled Violets. Clarence Jordan once wrote, God is not a celestial prison warden jangling the keys on a bunch of lifers. God is a shepherd searching for his sheep, a father searching for his child, an old woman searching for her coin. I have always loved this quote because, for me, it sharpens the image of a benevolent God. Here is one who seeks. Here is one who pursues. Here is one who searches for her beloved. And when God finds her beloved, she celebrates them and affirms them and readies them to live into their potential. Thanks be to God. I realize that we're reading Matthew's gospel this morning, and I also realize that it's Luke's gospel who tells us about lost sheep and coins and sons. But sometimes we need to pause and we need to consider what we understand to be the nature and character of God. In other words, what's your context for God? Because some of the time, maybe even most of the time, I think we need to let God's character lead us just as much as the text we read. I think that's especially true for some of Matthew's texts today included that are heavy on judgment and heavy on absolute depictions of good and evil and heavy on end of times language. So, before we even begin considering our text, I want to ask you to think about what kind of decision maker you think God is. Is God rash? Is God inflexible? Does God define each one of us in absolute terms? Does God discard those of us who fall short in game show like fashion with fancy red buttons and zapping motions? Does God dole out retributive, vengeful justice for the world? Or is God patient and creative and adaptable and sometimes ambiguous? Does God like to give hugs instead of zap people? Does God offer restorative, healing justice for the world? Well, when I read this morning's text, I was thinking about a God who likes to hug people and who is creative in offering healing. And so that version of God colors my interpretation of this morning's text. One day, a householder went to the locally owned nursery, bought their finest organic seed, and spread it generously in the field. We aren't told why or even who did it. Maybe the householder cut someone off on Highway 51 or skipped a place in line, but someone, an enemy, came by night and sowed bad seeds, weeds, in the field. A few weeks later, when the seeds began to break through the soil, the householder's workers identified the problem. Uh-oh, boss. You've got bad seeds, or you've got bad weeds mixing in with good wheat. What did you buy? And should we start weeding right away? The householder assures the laborers that what was planted was of the best quality, but someone has sabotaged the operation. Don't pull up the weeds just yet, though, the householder instructs. You'll only end up hurting the good wheat in the process. Let's wait until the harvest. Then we can more easily and more accurately separate the weeds from the wheat. When both piles are gathered, we'll burn the weeds and store the wheat. There are a lot of things that we can explore in this passage. We can spend time thinking about the fact that Matthew's God doesn't seem to deny the existence of evil in the world, nor does Matthew's Jesus ignore the fact that there are counterforces to his ministry. So in this week's parable, it's not just a lack of fertile soil that challenges discipleship. It's the existence of active agents seeking to actively inhibit discipleship. We could also talk about the idea that it's not easy to distinguish wheat from weeds until the seeds flower. If the field is the church or our gathered faith community, that means that we might actually have adversarial agents within our own body, and not only that, but we may not be able to recognize them at such an early stage in our growth. And sometimes it may even be the very pillars and systems we falsely deem good. It's not lost on me that we have another story about master and slave. Could it be that the proponents of the vassal system are weeds posing as wheat? Could it be that the social constructions of race and sexuality and class and nationality, could it be that these social constructions are seeds sown to cause destruction and are especially destructive seeds because They appear to be so familiar and so similar to us when we stay in our agricultural bubble. But what really jumped out at me regarding our parable this morning is the idea of patience. We read the end of this lection with its talk of angels and demons, rays of sunshine and flaming furnaces, and gnashing teeth. Ugh, gnashing teeth. I hate that image. And we can tend to view God's judgment as coming soon and as coming harsh and as coming in absolute terms. What a shame. Because when I read this parable, the householder says, wait, give this process some time. Let's not jump to conclusions about what's wholly good and what's wholly bad. We can do that in due time. What I hear in this passage is not a command for God's disciples to weed out those whom they are ill-equipped to recognize. But rather, what I hear instead is a reminder that God's going to let God's seed grow, and that God's going to cultivate growth in the same way and with the same pursuit as that of shepherds looking for their sheep, and daddies looking for their lost sons, and for old women looking for lost coins. Last summer, Mary Jane Osborne invited my daughters to come and see her garden. Mary Jane had an adjacent lot to her home, and on the week that we came, she asked her gardener not to mow the grass. She thought that my girls would enjoy picking all of the violets and dandelions growing amidst the tall grass. And they did, immensely. And Mary Jane and I enjoyed watching them. Mary Jane saw something unique and beautiful in those weeds. Where most people might see a nuisance and an impediment to a healthy, manicured lawn, she saw something that would offer pleasure and joy and giggles to two little girls. I believe that we belong to a creator who has the ability to see the potential in all of her children. And better still, we belong to a creator who longs for, who works for, who waits with patience for such a potential to be realized, even in, especially in, children with weed-like behavior. I think that for too long we've been focused on a judgment day where there are more people bundled and tossed in a fiery furnace than there are gathered in God's barn. And yes, 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 there is evil in this world. And I, like each of you, am anxious to root it out. But the pluck and chuck method is a glorified form of retributive justice. And to pluck and to chuck our neighbors and our enemies from our communities without first searching for understanding does not model the God who created us. To do so models the very evil that is cyclical and systemic and life-draining. If, like the householder, we take a more measured and a more patient approach in viewing the life and growth of the seeds among us, we might be delighted to discover that there is much more wheat than weed among us. We might also discover that our rush to identify the weeds in our own field is the very weed that is choking our wheat. The parable doesn't tell us that God's barn is small, and the parable doesn't tell us that God has a quota, and the parable doesn't tell us that God is in a rush. The parable simply says that God's getting about the process of making God's world God's world. In the meantime, may we simply be bound to God's grace and God's love. We may just discover violets in empty lots. We may just discover that so many of the ones we rush to deem intruders just take a little longer to show their potential. We may just discover that there's no need for a burn pile because the harvest is just that good. Friends, may it be so, and may it be soon. Amen.